Hello there. Today we're going to talk about Emile Durkheim's study of suicide. And I know that's a very depressing subject, but it has several purposes behind it. Number one, it shows us a method of research that we use in sociology called the use of existing data. And notice this, like all of our research methods, takes the discussion above what's my opinion, what's your opinion, and then takes those opinions and tests them. So we have some basis to discuss things with. In 1898, Durkheim, a French sociologist, laid the basis for a lot of data-based sociology by publishing a study on suicide. Now, if you and I were to study suicide, one of the first things we might take a look at would be psychological phenomena, individual phenomena, all of which is relevant. Was the person depressed? Did they have a catastrophe in their life? Things of that nature. But Durkheim said, while that's all true, he wanted to get more specific than that and look at other aspects as well, and he wanted to look at group behavior. And so he asked the questions, do different groups have different rates of suicide? In other words, per 100,000, do Protestants kill themselves more or less often than Catholics or Jews? Might be a question we'd take a look at. So the purpose of this study, and the reason I'm bringing it to you, is to number one, show the scientific method in action, and number two, show a difference in perspective between psychology, which is very individually oriented, and sociology, which is group oriented. And so we'll go through the study in step-by-step fashion. What he did is he looked at the census material. So he's using existing data. He didn't collect the data. He's looking at data others have collected. And it's the census material of Western Europe. And he starts finding several things. For example, if you looked at unmarried people versus married, who do you think would have the highest suicide rate? Good question. Well, we make jokes about being married and how painful it can be and how difficult it is, but the reality is that married had the lowest suicide rate and unmarried had the highest suicide rate. And that's data that continues to the present day, by the way. Children or no children? Well, you see a pattern starting to form here? There were attachments in being married, and if you have children, there's attachments as well. If I get depressed, I think about often myself, but who's going to take care of the kids? And so I have an attachment to live for, a reason to do something. So people with no children had higher suicide rates. People with children had lower suicide rates. Then he looked at things like religion, and he found that when you looked at Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, three groups that 100 years ago were really quite distinct in their living, their interaction, and so forth, and their behaviors to some extent, not that much different, in 2004 or the present time. What he found was that there was significant difference in suicide rates. He found Protestants had the highest rate, Catholics had the middle rate, and Jews, the group of people who had been persecuted the most, had the lowest rate. Okay? Here's some other findings. So far we've got this married versus unmarried, children versus no children, Protestants versus Catholics and Jews, and he had some other findings as well. For example, during economic depression, what do you think happens to suicide rate? Or economic recession even, when things start getting worse for people? Well, common sense would suggest what should happen? You're right, it goes up. But one of the things that he found that didn't make common sense was that also during times of quick prosperity, suicide rates went up. Okay, so now he's collected his data, he's looked at the census, he's got some hypotheses, he's found a whole bunch of ideas of what occurred from the real data. Now he's going to try to explain it. And he says there are three basic types of suicide, actually four, but we're only going to cover three of the three main types. And under each one, I want you to try to understand that type of suicide and then plug in the previous data and see what seems to fit best. The first type is an egoistic suicide. And that term more or less rings a bell for all of us. It's a little bit different. It's not egotistic, but egoistic. And the ego always refers to what? Well, it refers to the self, or me. And what this means is individuals with fewer attachments have higher suicide rates. Well, why would that be? Well, let's say I'm not married, I have no kids, I don't have a job, and something really goes wrong. Well, who do I turn to? I don't have anybody to turn to. Now, there's nothing wrong with being self-reliant and highly self-supporting and individualistic. It's just that those people have fewer people to help them in times of crises. What would fit under that? Well, the unmarried, less connection than the married, the no children, less connection than those who have children. And then finally, one of the odd things is the Protestant Catholic Jewish phenomena. The Protestants, the root word here is protest. They protested against who? They protested against the Catholic Church. And their big emphasis was they thought the Catholic Church was too group-dominated, too power-centralized, and so they pushed individuality. They pushed an individual relationship between the person and God as opposed to a relationship between the person and the religious community or the priest or the archbishop or the bishop or the pope. And so the Protestants were much more individualistic at that time, and so he argued that's why they had higher suicide rates. Number two, ANOMIC. And that's ANOMIC. It's a word that's similar to ANOMI that you see in the chapter on deviance. And what this means is fast changes in society. Unclear rules because of those fast changes. So if we have a traditional society with little change or very slow change, we have low rates of ANOMI. If we have a society like our own, in which there's rapid change, technological, moral, religious, we have tremendously unclear rules at times. And so when we look at anomic suicides, he argues that in times of economic recession, as well as prosperity, in other words, anytime we have major change in society, we have more likelihood of suicide because of those rapid changes. The classic example going on right now is a place I've traveled to 3 times and I'm about to go to again this summer, and that's China. The first year I went there, there was almost no prostitutes, as the society was changing enormously and very quickly, and people were being thrown out of work. By the 4th year that I was there were prostitutes from the farms all over the place, young girls trying to make a living. The suicide rate had increased dramatically, and oddly enough, increased dramatically among young women. They were the most displaced in this industrializing country. The third type of suicide, we didn't really have an example for that I gave you about Durkheim, but I'll give one as we go here now, and that's altruistic. Altruistic suicide is a suicide that I perceive as being good for the good of the group. If I'm deeply in debt and I feel like I can help my family because I'll get the insurance policy, I might secretly run my car into a bridge out there under I-55 because, you know, as stupid as it sounds, they're going to get insurance, and from my perspective, I'm killing myself to help the wife and the kids. Now, of course, the wife and the kids probably wouldn't see it that way. The altruistic suicide is suicide to help others, or for the good of the group. The kamikaze of World War II. My father was on a merchant marine ship, and he was a boiler worker, and a kamikaze plane, fortunately he happened to be out of the boiler room, and a kamikaze plane split the ship right in half. The idea was that the kamikaze pilots, many of whom believed that the Emperor of Japan was a direct descendant of the sun god, that they were doing good for their society by killing themselves and destroying a large American ship or allied ship, while at the same time sacrificing their life and one small inexpensive plane. And we've seen altruistic suicides in some of these religious cults, where they believe by killing themselves they're furthering their righteous behavior. In fact, there's one going on in the news today, right today, out in Utah, by the way, that could end up in this sort of thing. All right, so now we've talked about the types of suicide. Let's do one final thing and look at his conclusion. What did he conclude? Was it the amount of money that one had that determined whether you were happy or sad or did one commit suicide or not? Didn't seem to come up in his findings at all. What was the one thing? The one thing that was common to all of these types of suicide was social cohesion. Sometimes called social integration. And all it means straightforward is that it's like the glue, like cohesion is like an adhesive tape. It's the glue that binds people together. So for the first types of suicide, the first two types, egoistic and anomic, the more social cohesion, the lower the suicide rate. For the last type of suicide, the altruistic, I thought I'm helping the group, so the more cohesive I am to the group, the more likely I am to commit suicide. So Durkheim concluded overall that one's degree of being connected to a social group of other human beings was directly related to the likelihood of committing suicide. You'll see this concept of social cohesion and social integration time and time again throughout the book and the course.